mastermind. That was on a Friday. And we came back from New York, and that whole weekend we were just celebrating. And on that Monday, John and I called her, and she said, well, we decided to pass. We couldn't get signed. Came close a million times, just couldn't get signed, couldn't get a deal.
It was 1980, and the rest disbanded. John did what any young, ambitious musician would do. He headed for New York City, where the music opportunities seemed limitless. John was on a mission. Somehow he was going to make this happen. So defined by family values and ties, it wasn't surprising that John's destination was a studio in Manhattan, co-owned by his record producer cousin, Tony Bon Jovi. The studio was a state-of-the-art facility called Power Station. Once again, John found himself with access to the best in town.
It was going to be one of a kind in Manhattan, and I think anywhere else, you know. I think John came around, I would say maybe 1980. I saw him. Maybe at that time he was 18 or 19 years old. And he was working in the studio as a PA. And, but I think you could tell he just wanted, he was into music, you know, he wanted to have his own band and he wanted to be a rock star. He really did, you could tell.
Cousin Tony worked with John to develop what would later become the famous Bon Jovi sound.
Yes, he was working with his cousin Tony at NAG. You know, they were doing, like, you know, figuring out what kind of music he could do, you know, what he was singing, and I guess what was best for him, you know. Doing demos, just to get started.
There was a radio station at that time called WAPP, which was a very powerful New York radio station, rock station. And there was an unsigned band contest to enter songs into. And John entered Runaway.
It's got a cool little keyboard riff. It's like, this sounds good.
I remember his first song was Runaway. And it came out on an album, the WAPP album. It was a radio album with local bands, and his song Runaway was on there. And that became a really, really big hit off of that album. So that's the only thing you heard in the summertime.
Then the time came for John to put another band together. He might have been based in New York, but of course the band members all came from New Jersey.
Well, I basically put the band together about a year and a half ago. Right. And it was around a song which is the single off our first album called Runaway. And what had happened was every record company, it seemed, in America turned down this song. And a local radio station here in New York picked it up, and it started to spread nationwide, and I had what was slowly becoming a hit without a band.
John really got the creme de la creme of the New Jersey musicians to come play. Tico was always like a legend because he played in this great band, Frankie and the Knockouts, and Alec played in a band called Phantom's Opera, and Dave was in Atlantic City Expressway prior, so they knew each other from high school.
And then we started playing out, and stumbled upon Richie Sambora, our lead guitar player, who I later hired, and that was really the band. It came together in just a few short weeks.
Anybody who witnessed John early on just knew he was a brilliant talent, so that's why people wanted to play with him, but he definitely got the best players that were in Jersey. I think John went through minimum 5 years of constant record companies saying no. And then they said, okay, you know, this is valid, and that's how the whole process began for him. That led to the record deal, ultimately.
He became John Bon Jovi and lent his new last name to the band. Finally, Bon Jovi was signed to Mercury Polygram. Rather like his mentor, Bruce Springsteen, it was only John who was signed to the label, the other members of the band all being hired guns. They
were doing okay. It was better than not being signed, but they worked their asses off during that time. I think the first tour, John and Richie took turns driving a station wagon because they didn't even have a tour bus. You know, so it wasn't easy. You know, it definitely wasn't easy.
The band released their first album in 1984, simply titled Bon Jovi. This was followed a year later by 7,800 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature at which rock melts. Then, Slippery When Wet was released in 1986, changing everything.
It was either 4th or 5th grade, I think, and it was Slippery When Wet album came out and everybody was talking about it. I know mostly the girls were talking about it at first. I remember this one girl I used to have a crush on in 4th grade, wanted the Slippery When Wet album, so that's how I remember it.
I wasn't really into the hair thing. I liked the pop stuff, like I was listening to Debbie Gibson and Tiffany, and I was a huge New Kids on the Block fan. And but then they released Never Say Goodbye in 1986, and I was just hooked.
I do remember after they recorded Slippery, John had phoned me up and said, you know, I want you to hear the record, come on over. And I was just shocked by it and said, whoa. And I do know that, if I remember that day correctly, their hopes were it was going to maybe go gold, maybe. That's what they were praying for, was that number.
I guess it's always a surprise when all of a sudden, you know, like in basically a month, we outsold, you know, what we did last year, you know, and records and stuff like that. And
that's quite scary.
Now it's been like, you know, 4 months, and it's probably about 4 times as much as we've done in all of last year and previous too. So I guess that feels real good.
To date, Slippery When Wet has sold in excess of 20 million copies worldwide.
If you were a guy, you know, you could listen to Bon Jovi, but it wasn't one of those things you really bragged about in front of your friends because they were perceived to be, you know, a girls' band. They weren't quite New Kids on the Block, but they weren't exactly Metallica. You know, it was one of those bands where, you know, you could love a band name come on the radio, like, this is pretty cool. You know, but one of your metalhead friends will come over and say, oh, these guys are posers. And you're like, yeah, they're posers. But they're kind of cool, you know? And meanwhile, you'd go home and rock out. And,
Did you learn how to play that song?
Bad Name? Yeah. Within a week that it was out.
Like, they were part of that whole, like, big hair rock bands of the 80s. And I would say, like, they were the best of that, you know, group. And so, you know, in that respect, yeah, definitely groundbreaking.
Back in the summer of 1987, in fact, I remember it, you couldn't walk 2 blocks and not see a girl in a Bon Jovi t-shirt. Go up to a girl's room and not see posters all over the wall. And they were a staple on MTV, and it was everywhere. You couldn't get away from it. I mean, it was like that nationwide and worldwide, but can you imagine being right in the core of New Jersey? And, you know, you get a homecoming concert at the end of a tour at the Meadowlands Arena. And you could just imagine the madness. It was all day, all week. It was like Super Bowl Sunday. The hype of the whole, you know, Bon Jovi's coming this week. You know, they're coming back, they're coming home.
That was a phenomenon, that was enormous. That changed the whole face of music. Had it not been for that record, there'd be a lot of people who didn't make it. You know, I mean, that paved the way for Def Leppard, that paved the way for Poison, for Skid Row, for Cinderella, for, I mean, Whitesnake, for everybody. So that was an unbelievably important record in the annals of rock and roll history.
It seems that not enough people have spent time discussing Bon Jovi on a musicianship level. Perhaps the fact that millions of people listen to their music is all that matters. But in terms of technical ability and songwriting, just how good are they?
They're in a class by themselves. I mean, every member on their own instrument, I mean, they're just
they're pretty much unmatched. I mean, Richie Sambora has a sound all his own.
I mean, I dig the Beatles a lot. John Lennon is kind of the king, you know, to me. I really dig John. I really dig the Beatles. And
what about guitar heroes?
There's a ton of them, man. Everybody's so good. You know, Eric Clapton, Johnny Winter, Jimmy Page, Brian May, Jeff Beck.
All the guys still around today.
Yeah, there's tons, and you know, I'm sure, and they learn from. Ask them what their heroes would be. It'd probably be, you know, the older guys, Willie Dixon, B.B. King, and all those guys.